Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 135, Back into the Blue. This podcast is recorded in Te Whanganui Atara, the rohe of Muupoko, Taranaki Whānui, Te Aotearoa and Ngāti Tūmatakōkiri. We are generously supported by our amazing patrons. If you want to support Hans, go to patreon.com/historyaotearoa. Last time, we covered Māori's first encounter with Europeans, that of the two Dutch ships commanded by Abel Tasman. The result being they managed to kill some of his crew and scare them off. Today, we will see what happened to him after that encounter, covering the rest of his time in Aotearoa's waters. After leaving Mohua Golden Bay around noon on the 19th of December 1642, Tasman and his crew spent the next day or so heading east towards D'Urville and Stevens Islands, on the western edge of the Marlborough Sounds. Along the way, Gilliesmans helped Vischer with some coastal surveying and cartography by making more sketches, and helped with calculations of coordinates. For the duration of the expedition so far, this was all he was really able to do, since his actual position was the merchant of the Zeehan. For that, he was meant to keep track of the goods they had, and oversaw negotiations to trade with anyone they came across. The idea being to get good deals and find out what resources indigenous peoples had of value, and what they valued in return, as well as the general bookkeeping of what they had, what they traded, and what they got for that. If you've been paying attention over the last few episodes, you'll note he hasn't really had a chance to do any trading, since the only people they found killed 4 Dutchmen, which is not a great way to start a trade relationship. As they sailed past what is now known as D'Urville Island, they were sailing at night, and didn't know what was in front of them. All they could see were the lanterns on each ship that they used to keep sight of one another in the dark. Thankfully, it was standard procedure when the ship was sailing blind for it to be the duty of one of the crew to occasionally cast a weighted line over the side of the ship, to ensure they didn't run aground. He would then let it out and walk backwards along the deck until the rope was fully out. If the rope got taut, meaning it touched the bottom, then he would alert the ship that they were sailing in shallow water, and how deep that water was, which he knew because the rope had knots tied in it at regular intervals. This is another way to do depth sounding, which we've talked about before. So, as the ships sailed at night towards the east, a line was cast over, and didn't hit anything. So, they knew that the water was pretty deep. Then, an hour later, they did it again. Same result. They continued to swing the lead, as it was known, every hour until about 1 a.m, and that time the line snapped rigid. An alert was put out, 25 fathoms. The sea bottom was rising to meet them, meaning they were going to run aground and maybe hit land on their current course. Tasman was awoken and informed of the situation, instructing the ships to turn around and sail back west until the morning, when they would be able to see what was around them. Of course, when day came, they could see land, a bight stretching from Wanganui to the Kapiti coast, the first European sighting of Te Ika Amawi. From here, Tasman decided they would head north, but foul weather forced them to turn back south and hunker down behind D'Urville Island until it passed, which wouldn't be for a number of days. On Christmas Eve, the ship's council convened to decide how they wanted to proceed, and it seems most of the officers wanted to head southeast and see what was there. Specifically, whether they could find a way through to the other side of the landmass. This desire to find a passage was due to those instructions given by the Batavian Council to find another route to Chile. However, remember that they didn't know the extent of Aotearoa and what would be on the other side of that body of water, or even if there was an other side at all. Tasman was more concerned about a lee shore, a strong westerly that would throw them onto the coast and shipwreck them. Given the fact that right now, as the council was convening, if they stepped outside, they would be pelted by wind and rain, this was a pretty valid concern. In fact, the weather had initially been so bad that the council weren't able to convene at all, because it was too rough to transfer the officers off the Zeihan and onto the Heimskirk, as they normally did. Taking that into account, the idea of heading southeast was scrapped, deemed too risky, in favour of heading north. Of course, nowadays we know the extent of Aotearoa, and that there is in fact a passage between the two islands. It's just that, due to Tasman's choice to head north, it got named after his quote-unquote successor, James Cook. You will sometimes hear people say that Tasman's decision to not explore to the southeast is because he didn't know that there was a passage down there. However, that isn't the case. Vischer, as pilot major, suspected there was a passage, and that was actually quite clever, because they couldn't explicitly see anything to that direction. He was relying on observing ocean currents to come to that conclusion. This is even noted in the ship's journal. Quote, "Since the tide comes from the southeast, so that there might well be a passage." End quote. So, to say that Tasman didn't know that the strait was there, or that he disagreed with Vischer, just isn't correct. That's not to say there wasn't a bit of uncertainty though, and they were cautious to confirm their hypothesis for certain because of the weather. Once that weather cleared up on the 25th of December, they headed north, keeping the coast in their sights to the east. Naturally, the 25th was Christmas, so a couple of pigs were killed and the crew was given extra rations of wine for the occasion. For the next week or so, the ships continued north, heading further out to sea if visibility became poor, or if the wind turned into a westerly and threatened to push them onto the rocks. Nothing hugely of note happens as they travel up the coast, other than the usual making of drawings, calculations, taking measurements, and all of that. They actually sailed the entire length of Te Ika a Maui with very little happening, apparently not spotting any safe harbours to anchor in, hence why they didn't attempt to make landfall. The interesting thing is that there are actually some good natural harbours that would have worked, such as Manukau and Kaipara, but the Dutch ships were possibly too far out to sea to recognise them for what they were. They did spot Kawhia Harbour, but didn't go give it a look, possibly due to Tasman once again being careful not to endanger the lives of his crew any more than necessary. Overall, the journal doesn't really mention anything too interesting at this point, not even spotting Taranaki, which we assume is because he was shrouded by cloud. That is, until the 5th of January 1643, when they get to what Tasman called the Three Kings Islands, so named after the feast day that they arrived on. Also known as Manuatafi, they are 55 kilometres northwest of Cape Ranga, so they are past the very northernmost point of the Aotearoa mainland. Given they hadn't had any success resupplying anywhere else, with their last top-up being in Mauritius a whole 5 months ago, Tasman and his crew were very much keen to get some more food and water. As such, the council decided to see if they could land somewhere on these islands, in search of fresh supplies or people who might be able to trade for it. By now, they had established a bit of a standard procedure when wanting to make a landing onto unknown shores. Vischer and Gilliesmans would be sent on one boat, along with an armed guard on another, to scout out the coast for where they think food and fresh water might be found, as well as suitable places to anchor. It seems they left the two main ships in the morning and spent pretty much the whole day trying to see what was around. When they returned in the evening, Vischer and Gilliesmans reported that they had found fresh water, quote, falling from a steep mountain in great abundance. But on account of the heavy surf, it was dangerous, nay, impossible to take it in there, end quote. So that was actually not too bad. The island had at least one thing that they needed. It was just a matter of figuring out a good place to land safely. After they found the waterfall, the pair and their entourage rowed around the island to see if they could find a good spot to anchor. However, they soon discovered they weren't alone. Quote, on the highest mountain, 30 to 35 persons, men of tall stature, as far as they could see from that distance, armed with sticks or club, who called out to them in rough, loud voice, which our men could not understand. That in walking they took enormously big, wide steps or strides, as our men were rowing about, some few in number now, and then showed themselves on the hilltops. End quote. The crew on the boats were wary of the people they saw on land, seeing that they were clearly armed and, given their previous experience, likely had Waka close at hand. The mention of the large strides seems to indicate the Dutch thought these people were of larger than average size for humans, but this is possibly due to their early telescopes making some objects look larger than they actually are. As was the case in Tasmania and Mohua, they didn't see any dwellings while they were rowing around, assuming that they were likely somewhere around the waterfall they saw earlier, given they also spotted garden plots around that area too. At least 2 waka were spotted on a beach, one of them broken, but otherwise the pilot major and merchant were unable to find a safe harbour to land. With this report, the ships drew closer to the shore and anchored for the night. The plan being to make an attempt to get some water the next day. First by finding that all-important anchorage, and then sending some men to the waterfall. However, no such harbour was found, and in the end it was deemed too dangerous to try and send a boat to the shore, due to the surf, rocks and water depth. A couple days earlier, just before they reached Three Kings, the council had chosen to sail northeast, but the lack of wind meant that wasn't possible. That wasn't necessarily terrible though. No wind meant that conditions were great to send some guys onto the islands and resupply, after which they would head out of sight of land once more. Now that this was proving to be easier said than done, a decision needed to be made, and they were more or less presented with 2 choices. Do they keep trying to find a way onto one of the islands for food and water, or leave it all behind and proceed northeast, in the hopes they might find greener pastures? In the end, they just wanted to cut their losses and see if there was anything worthwhile somewhere else. With that finalised, the council disbanded. The officers of the Zeehan returned to their ship to inform the crew of their new heading, and the 2 ships sailed off into Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, leaving Aotearoa behind. Europeans wouldn't return for over 100 years. The Dutch would be on the open sea for the next 2 weeks, until they came across an island on the 19th of January. Since this was a quote-unquote new island, Tasman got to give it a name, in this case choosing either one after a tropical bird or a woman's breasts. Sources seem to disagree a little bit on this point. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, because the island is today known as Ata, and is 160 kilometres south of Tonga. From there, Tasman headed to Tongatapu, the main island of Tonga, where, after months at sea without touching any land and not getting any more water or food, They finally made landfall. Imagine just how grateful those guys must have been to simply touch dirt. Naturally, the islands of Tonga were already inhabited, and the Dutch seem to have gotten on much better with the locals than their previous experiences. The Tongans visited the ship, and eventually returned to shore to collect supplies with some of the Dutch, including ghilliesmans and some armed guards. Just in case. The locals did show the Dutch to some wells, but these were apparently not drinkable, or at least not up to the Dutch standards, as it was, quote, quite green and dirty colour, end quote. Plus, there wasn't much of it to be worth the effort of scooping it into barrels with coconut shells. After this, they went to the local village and hung out with the chief, who gave the skipper leading the group a coconut shell filled with water to share with him. This seems to have possibly been to try and convince the Dutch that the water was actually drinkable. The Tongans also seem to have maybe given them a pig, but other than that, the crew returned to the ships empty-handed. Thankfully, the next day, the Tongans expanded the wells and allowed 9 casks to be filled. So, the water can't have been that bad. It was here that ghilliesmans was also finally able to do some trading with the goods they had on board, giving the Tongans linen, a metal knife, nails and beads, in exchange for chickens, pigs, coconuts and bananas. The Dutch, as a sign of friendship, also offered the Tongans a white flag, which they tied to one of their houses. The friendliness of the Tongans, and perhaps their somewhat easier communication, may have been helped by the fact that Tasman wasn't the first European here. Le Maire had also been here before in 1616. While all of this was going on, Tasman had trouble maintaining discipline, since many of the Tongan women, apparently, wanted to have sex with the Dutch, openly groping their genitals. At one point, 2 very tall women grabbed Halbos, the barber surgeon, around the neck, with the intention of having quote-unquote fleshy intercourse with him. Which, I don't want to be presumptive of Halbos's kinks, but some people nowadays are into that sort of thing. However, Tasman was a kink shamer and expressly forbade this, partially in an attempt to maintain discipline. Desertion was a real possibility in these sorts of situations. But he also was likely wary of the spread of STDs, both among his crew and the Tongans. On the 23rd of January, after 4 days resupplying, mingling and trading with the Tongans, the Heimskirk accidentally drifted 11 kilometres out to sea, despite still being anchored. When the Zeehan, which hadn't drifted, caught up to them, the ship's council decided to just not return to Tongatapu, and instead continue on northeast to find other islands where they could take on more water. On the 24th to 26th of January, sources differ on the exact day, they arrived in Nomuka, an island just northeast of Tongatapu. But, unlike the main Tongan island, Tasman was the first European at Nomuka. Here, they stopped for a few days to take on some more fresh water. It also seems at this point that Tasman's fears were shown to be justified, because his crew were starting to lag more generally in their discipline. The journal mentions that on the 27th, some of the men, quote, did not observe their ordained watches well, which often might lead to danger and disadvantage of these our ships and crews, end quote. As an aside, the journal then lists the punishments the council came up with if someone was found sleeping on watch, or otherwise neglecting their duties. Quote, first time they shall be breached by the partners of his watch. The second time, besides the breaching, he shall forfeit a month's pay. For the third time, 6 months of his earned pay. and the 4th time he shall be deprived of his office and pay, or if the same be a sailor, he shall have to serve without pay." End quote. I wasn't able to find exactly what breaching meant, but it could range anywhere from being caned on the arse to full-on fucking keel hauling. Sleeping on watch was, and still is, a very serious offence, so it isn't totally impossible that the punishment would be harsh. On top of this, the council didn't want anyone carrying candles or other sources of fire unless they were explicitly doing something in service of the ship. Quote, "All this on pain of being put in irons, and forfeiting a month's pay besides." End quote. Fire on a wooden ship was always a danger. But why this was an issue right now, the journal doesn't say. Perhaps because things were getting a bit lax in general, and if someone dropped a candle during some tomfoolery, that would be catastrophic. The entry goes on to talk about punishments for making noise on watch or abandoning your post, and also that people aren't allowed to be brought on board without the express permission of Tasman, ghilliesmans, or the skipper. Quote, "on pain of corporal punishment." End quote. From the sounds of it, this mostly stemmed from the fact that they were all going a bit stir-crazy after being at sea for months. Or, if the naming of Utter is to be believed, after so long with only men for company, they were just seeing boobs everywhere they looked. And Tasman was trying to crack down on women being brought on board. This could have been alleviated a bit by allowing the crew to spend some time ashore, which the sailors seem to have greatly wanted. But Tasman, ever the sexless kink-shamer, denied this, due to the weather being bad on the 30th of January. They were allowed to go ashore on the 31st, but that was cut short, again by the weather. Along with issues within the crew, there seems to have been tensions within the officers of the council itself, who were potentially voicing their grievances privately, which was gradually making its way to Tasman's ears, because the journal also mentions that, quote, "we recommended to every member of the council to kindly inform us of anything that anyone might know more than ourselves, or might have heard which would be to the advantage of the honourable company, in order to assist us with all due zeal and diligence. We also admonished each kindly and earnestly to act in every respect in such a way as he intends to answer for on his return to Batavia before the Honourable Governor-General and Councillor of India." End quote. In other words, if you hear someone stirring shit, perhaps even mutiny between the crew, rat them out to the commander. And also, don't be the one stirring shit. Act like the Governor-General himself is watching, or at the very least, that he's going to hear about it in the end, and that is not going to turn out well for you. After doing some more resupplying and trading, on the 31st of January, they had a parting ceremony with the local people of Nomuka, and the next day, the Dutch sailed northwest. At some point during their stopover, the ship's council had decided that they wouldn't be proceeding any further east during this voyage. Why the council decided this isn't totally clear, but with the crew's emotions running high, even among the council itself, it stands to reason that everyone was pretty keen to get home, and not risk mutiny. So, they decided now was the time to start making their way back to Batavia. Their search for Terra Australis, the great southern continent, was now over. Next time, we will talk about the end of the 1642 expedition, and the aftermath of how the Batavian Council received Tasman's reports. If you want to get in touch, my email and social media are on historyaotearoa.com. You can also find helpful resources there, like transcripts and sources. If you'd like to support Hans, you can do so through donating via Patreon or giving us a review. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.